If you're studying environmental law in India, well, there's one case that you absolutely positively have to know inside and out, and that's MC Mehta versus the Union of India. Honestly, it's a game changer, a real cornerstone judgment that completely redefined corporate liability. So in this explainer, we're going to break down every single critical detail you'll need to ace your exams.
Right, so this is the one we're diving into, MC Mehta versus the Union of India, but you'll probably know it better as the Oleum gas leak case. Now, the judgment came down in late 1986, and you've got to remember the context here. This was just 2 years after the horrifying Bhopal gas tragedy. That event was definitely weighing heavily on the Supreme Court's mind. So this wasn't just another case, it was a landmark decision that was about to fundamentally shake up the legal landscape for corporate accountability in India.
All right, to get our heads around this complex case, we've broken it all down into 6 key sections. We'll kick things off with the industrial disaster that started it all. Then we'll get into the weeds of the groundbreaking legal principle the court literally invented. From there, we'll see how the court actually bent its own rules to deliver justice, tackled some deep constitutional questions, and then we'll wrap it all up by looking at the incredible legacy of this one judgment.
Okay, let's set the scene. So how did this all begin? With a disaster, actually. A leak of this super toxic oleum gas from a factory located right in the heart of Delhi. And we're not talking about some remote industrial park here. This was in a densely populated area. It caused widespread panic and, real, actual harm to people. This whole event really put the Supreme Court in a tight spot, forcing it to ask some hard questions about whether the laws on the books were even close to strong enough to protect its citizens.
And this was the fundamental challenge, wasn't it? The main legal precedent they had to work with was an English case from, get this, 1868. Just think about that for a second. A 19th century rule for a 20th century industrial disaster happening in a rapidly modernizing India. The court really had to ask itself, can we seriously use this ancient rule, or do we need to forge a completely new path here?
And that question brings us to the single most important legal outcome of this case, the creation of a brand new, incredibly powerful principle. You see, faced with this outdated rule, the court decided, nope, we can't be held back by the past. It realized it needed to forge a legal shield that was built for India's modern industrial age.
This quote right here really captures the court's bold stance. It's a clear declaration of judicial activism. The judges are basically saying, look, we're not just here to interpret old laws. Our job is to actively evolve the law to meet new challenges. It's this powerful statement that India can't be tied to 19th century English precedents forever. It has to build its own jurisprudence for its own problems. A real moment of judicial independence.
So what was this old rule? Well, it was the rule of strict liability, and it came from that English case Rylands versus Fletcher. Now, this rule said that if you bring something dangerous onto your land for a non-natural use and it gets out and hurts someone, you're liable. It was a step up from just proving negligence for sure, but it wasn't absolute.
And here's why it wasn't absolute. The rule of strict liability came with a bunch of built-in exceptions. A company could get off the hook by arguing the harm was caused by, say, a freak natural disaster, an act of God, or that a total stranger caused it, or even that the victim somehow consented to the risk. The Supreme Court looked at these exceptions and basically called them escape hatches, totally unsuitable for massive, hazardous industries.
So the difference between these two is absolutely crucial. This slide lays it out perfectly. The Supreme Court basically just said, for hazardous industries, all those exceptions, gone. Instead, it created this new, much tougher principle, absolute liability. It completely plugged all those legal loopholes, moving from a standard with get-out-of-jail-free cards to one with none at all.
Okay, for your exam, this is the definition you need to know, word for word. This is the heart of the doctrine. The duty is absolute, meaning total, complete, and it's non-delegable, which is key. It means the company can't just pass the blame and say a contractor messed up. If you're running a dangerous operation and people get hurt, you are 100% responsible for paying compensation. Period. End of story.
The court's logic here was just so simple and powerful, It's basically the polluter pays principle. The argument is that the company creating the risk and making a profit from it is in the best position to prevent accidents, so it only makes sense that they should be the one to bear the cost when things go wrong. The court was essentially saying that potential compensation isn't some surprise penalty, it should be factored in as a cost of doing business.
And this is brilliant. It shows exactly what the court was thinking about deterrence. Compensation wasn't just about paying back the victim. It was about sending a crystal clear message. The court established what you could call a deep pockets principle. The richer the company, the more it has to pay. This makes sure that the penalty isn't just a slap on the wrist, but a major financial blow that will deter future negligence.
Okay, so having a strong new rule like absolute liability is great, but it's pretty useless if regular people can't actually use it to get justice, right? The court totally got this. So its next big move was to shake things up on the procedural side of the law, specifically by expanding its own powers under Article 32 of the Constitution.
This was the big question hanging over everything. I mean, traditional court procedures can be incredibly slow, super expensive, and really intimidating. For the victims of this gas leak, a lot of whom were poor and didn't have many resources, filing a case the old-fashioned way would have been next to impossible. So to fix this, the court really championed public interest litigation, or PIL, and expanded its own powers to bridge this huge gap in access to justice.
This slide pretty much sums up the procedural revolution that went down. The court declared that under Article 32, it wasn't going to be tied down by old-school procedures. It could invent new remedies, like directly ordering companies to pay money as compensation. It relaxed the rule of locus standi. You know, the rule that says only the direct victim can sue. Now, a social activist like MC Mehta could file a case on behalf of everyone. The court even said it could take a simple letter from a concerned citizen and treat it like a formal court case. I mean, this made the highest court in the country accessible to literally everyone. Now we're getting into some seriously complex constitutional stuff. The right to life, Article 21, is a fundamental right. But here's the catch. Fundamental rights are usually only enforceable against the state as defined in Article 12. Shriram was a private company, so the court had to answer this massive question. Could a private company like Shriram actually be considered the state when it comes to enforcing these rights?
So this was the legal test they had to figure out. If Shriram could be called an instrumentality or agency of the state, then it would fall under that other authorities umbrella in Article 12. And if that happened, it would have to follow the rules in the Fundamental Rights chapter, and a petition under Article 32 could be brought against it. To answer this, the court had to go back and look at how this legal test had evolved over time in its previous decisions.
And you can see the law evolving right here. At first, in the Rajasthan State Electricity Board case, the definition was pretty narrow. It was mainly about bodies created by a specific law. But the court quickly realized that was too limiting. Then came the landmark R.D. Shetty case, where it came up with a much more flexible, multi-factor test. And that test was cemented in the Ajay Hasia case, where the court made it super clear that what an entity does is more important than how it was legally born.
This 5-point checklist from the R.D. Shetty case? This is another one of those things you'll want to have down cold for your exams. The court looks at a bunch of stuff. Financial ties to the state, how much control the state has, if it has a monopoly, and, this is a big one, the nature of the job it's doing. Is it a public function? It's not a rigid formula, though. The court stressed that these are just clues, and the final decision depends on looking at the whole picture.
And this quote just nails the core idea behind the test. The court is saying loud and clear that labels don't matter. It doesn't care if a company was formed under the Companies Act or by a special law. What matters is its purpose, its function, and its relationship with the government. The court is willing to look right past the corporate veil to see what an entity is really all about.
Okay, so with that legal test all laid out, the court then did the logical next step. It applied it directly to Shriram, the company that caused the gas leak. It went through the checklist, factor by factor, to see if Shriram could be seen as an extension of the state.
And this table here breaks down the key evidence. Let's just walk through the big three. First up, public function. Well, Shriram was making fertilizers, an industry the government itself had labeled as being of vital public interest. Check. Number 2, state control. The company was tangled up in a whole web of government rules and licenses, and the state even had the power to just take over its management. Check. And number 3, financial help. Shriram had gotten huge loans from government-backed financial institutions. Checkmate.
So, looking at all this evidence, the court found there was a strong prima facie case. That's just legal talk for it. At first glance, the evidence is pretty convincing. Now, it's important to note that the court didn't give a final, definitive ruling on this specific point in this particular judgment. But you could totally see the writing on the wall. The judges were strongly hinting that yes, a private company doing a public job with a lot of state support can absolutely be treated as the state and held accountable for violating fundamental rights.
All right, let's wrap this up by looking at the monumental impact of this single judgment. Seriously, MC Mehta isn't just another case in a textbook. It's more like a legal earthquake that sent shockwaves through both environmental and constitutional law in India.
So to recap the whole thing, this case was a massive turning point. For your exams, you've got to remember these 4 huge legacies. 1. It created the powerful doctrine of absolute liability. 2. It beefed up the Supreme Court's power to award direct compensation. 3. It cemented public interest litigation as a vital tool for justice. And 4. It completely changed the game for corporate accountability by pulling private companies into the orbit of constitutional responsibility.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. The principle of absolute liability was born from the smokestacks of the industrial age, right? But today, we face all these new complex risks. We're talking data breaches, genetic engineering, climate change. So the critical question for all of us, and for the next generation of lawyers and judges, is this: how can this powerful legal weapon, forged back in 1987, be adapted to hold companies accountable for the new and unforeseen harms of our crazy modern world?